Hi guys, it's Isa. Today we're gonna do fantasy book recommendations for beginners part 2. So a while ago I did the first part of this video in which I introduced some fantasy books
and I've received a lot of good feedback both in here and in Instagram
asking me to please do a little bit more of those videos, so I decided to create another one, and this one will be mainly adult fantasy books so that hopefully you can have a wide range of books to decide upon. And without further ado, let's start. These recommendations are going to be somewhat ordered from what I consider it's a little bit more easy to get into to what I consider to be a little bit more complex read, either because it's a bigger commitment in terms of length of the book or because you need to connect more dots to it. And we will start with the Black Prism, and this book is fantastic if you want to start into fantasy. It has kind of like this flavor of what is supposed to be fantasy, right? We will have, in terms of setting, a little bit of a medieval world, and we will be facing this society where there's a hard magic system, meaning that this magic system has rules based on colors. And so there's a little bit of a thing getting into those colors, but it's really easy. In terms of tropes, there's a little bit of an evil versus good kind of fight. There's this training and grown-up story, which I believe are really accessible as well. And overall, the writing style, it's also very kind of like fun, it's light, and it's also a very good blend between a character and a plot-driven story. And the story will follow this land where they are kind of ruled by this Black Prism, and this is the person that is kind of like the emperor. And as I was saying before, people has the ability to have magic through colors. Usually people can have like access to 1-2 colors maybe, and the prism is like
the person that has access to all of them. He never tires, and because of that he's kind of like the ruling person.
However, this person is supposed to live just very limited years, and our main character, the prism, has already surpassed those years, and he knows that he is gonna die soon. And one day he just receives this note saying that he has a child, a son. There are different points of view in this story. One is going to be the prism and the other one is going to be the sun, and we will see how, you know, like both paths start to be separated, then obviously they're blend and the story move forward, and we will see not just that, but how this world, it's a little bit complex. There's a lot of great characters, and there's also like this emerging evil that is happening, and how our main characters need to really sharpen their skills in order to be prepared for that war. It's fascinating. Then we move to a book that is way different, but again really accessible, which is the Atlas 6. This, in terms of setting, it's gonna be this dark academia vibe, and unraveled in a world where the library of Alexandria still exists, and this is kind of like a college for special mages to hone their abilities. And so every year it seems that there are different invitations to different people to get into this college. And so this story will follow 6 points of view, which, if you are new, it might seem a little bit too much, but really kind of like the writing style, it isn't juvenile, but the topics and what is happening, it's kind of like easy enough to manage all of those. Each of these people have special powers, and these powers are really different between themselves, and they are drawn together to this school in which they are kind of left alone, and you know, they need to protect this school, but they will soon see that there is kind of like another level onto it. The dynamics between the characters, it's really interesting, and they are very different. I think again it's a good blend between character and plot driven. Maybe it leans a little bit more to plot driven side.
Even though we have 6 points of view,
I wasn't super attached to them, but nonetheless it was really addicting, and really it's something that you can read in one sitting, and it will give you kind of like the basics. We will see elemental magic, but we will also see kind of like a little bit of kind of time travel, so it touches different stuff in fantasy, and I think it's great. Then we go to a somewhat more darker story with Vicious by B. Schwab, which is a very popular writer within fantasy. In terms of setting, it's an urban fantasy story, which means that it's a story that might be unfold kind of like today, right? Like we can see this happening. It has a lot of elements that are common to us. It's a blend between a character and plot driven, because there's a lot that happens. In fact, the story is told knowing that something will happen, and there's kind of like this countdown until we reach to that moment. So obviously we are drawn and compelled to reach that moment, but there are two main characters that are really different, and we get to know them. We get to really know their motivations and what they are pursuing. This will follow two main characters that were really like the best friends back in college, but they did something, and we move forward in time with one of them in a jail. And kind of like this story unfolds from there. We see how these characters will need to come close again, and now they are really enemies.
They are really vicious between themselves.
The story gets dark really quickly, so be aware of that. Then we go to one of my favorite authors, Brandon Sanderson, with Elantris. Elantris, it's probably one of the first fantasy books that I read, but I don't consider it to be like necessarily the best point of entry because it's a little bit slow. So it's easy because the fantasy element, it's really, 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 really minimum. And so if you are kind of like,
oh, I don't want to get too much into fantasy,
this is a good point. If you feel comfortable with topics that revolve around politics, around a religion, and we will be following different points of view. There are three main points of view. The first of them is of this prince that contracts this terrible sickness, and because of that he's kind of like expelled to Elantris. He's like kind of like, you're now dead, you go there, and things go from there, and how he will survive and make a space for himself in Elantris, this city that before were the city where the gods lived. Then we have the point of view of a woman that was supposed to be married with this prince, and she just comes with the aftermath of he not being there, but she nonetheless needing to prevent a war. And then we have the third point of view, the religious one, which is this kind of priest that is trying to create a new religion, and that he has a timeline of a few months. If he's not able to do that, the country is going to be drawn into war. A very good way also to get into Brandon Sanderson is a standalone. Then we go to a book that it's probably a blend between different genres, and maybe you feel comfortable getting into it if you are used to read a little bit of horror or also sci-fi, and that is The Bone Shard Daughter. In terms of setting, you will need to imagine this Asian-inspired land where we have an emperor, and this emperor performs magic. The magic in this world, it's a heart system, which is that this emperor is able to create constructs which are kind of monsters by putting together kind of like things and ensuring that those things come to life with bones that he kind of takes away from people. It has kind of like that horror slide element. The story will unfold in this land where this magic was necessary because before there was kind of like this bigger threat to these people, and these constructs were the only ones that were able to prevent this bigger evil. But this evil, it's not here anymore, and so like the people, it's a little bit tired of all of this that's happening, and we will have different points of view in this. I'm just gonna be highlighting two, but there are at least four that are kind of like relevant. The first one is of this daughter of the emperor that has forgotten everything. She has no memories, and she is kind of like in this training path. And then we have the point of view of other character who is kind of like this man that has lost his wife, and he is just seeking her, but in the path of doing so he kind of like connects with an animal companion
that I loved.
Then we go to one of my favorite books of last year, and oh my god, I'm just so happy that I'm sharing these books with you all. This is The Sword of Kaigen. It's a standalone, and it's a really other thing. It's easy to get into it because the magic system, it's elemental magic, which is a magic that I believe is easy, meaning you can manage power based on the different elements: fire, earth, water, and air. The majority of them, or at least in Kaigen, they are the ones with ice. It's easy to get into it, and it's easy as well to understand. You don't need to have like a lot of knowledge of fantasy. We are in this land and we are being attacked and we need to defend it, and that's kind of like the story how it is. So we will really see war scenes, but I think it's a little bit complex because it has a different tone. It's really character driven, which I loved, and it has mainly the point of view of a mother and a son, which I believe it's a little bit different from what we're used to in fantasy. But beyond that, it has kind of like this structure in which we will have like two main stories. I think like the main story, or what we believe is the main story, will be kind of like revealed, or it will conclude, and you will be kind of like in a 40% or 50% of the book, and you're like,
all right, now what?
And then another thing happens. You know, it's kind of like, it's not the usual narration, so you need to be a little bit mindful of that. It's a little bit slow at the beginning, but it really takes off. It has one of the most vivid action scenes that I've read ever, and really I sobbed and I cried with this book no end. It really has created a massive mark. Then we go to The Lies of Locke Lamora, which is again a really great book if you are new to fantasy, because the fantasy element, it's not really there. Like the world, it's kind of magical, but it's at its core a heist of a heist. That's kind of like what the story is about. I consider this to be a little bit more advanced because of how the story is told and how the narrations go, but the story in itself, it isn't complex, and it's really kind of like compelling, and it's really adventurous, it's really plot driven, but we also have a lot of character moments. There's a lot of banter between the different characters, and for these we will need to imagine kind of like a world where there are different gangs and they are kind of like fighting for the power, and there's a lot of structure there, and we will have kind of like the story of one of these small bands trying to, you know, just make a heist. In terms of tropes, we will have a lot of found family vibes, a lot of kind of like heist. There's this character that has a lot of wit, a lot of charisma. It's not funny in itself, but the characters try to be light, you know, and the things that happen, although they are not necessarily happy and they're a little bit savage, you know, there's kind of like this element to it that you, once that you learn about these characters, you cannot forget them. Then we have The Puppy War, which is a book that was everywhere a few years back. It's great to start into fantasy because the magic system, it's again elemental magic. At its core, it's a war and deeply strategic story, so beware, there's a lot of war in this trilogy, which is concluded, and there's a lot of strategy underneath it. So if you're comfortable with those elements, this is going to be fantastic for you. It's a story that honestly, since I read it, it wasn't my cup of tea and I needed to push through it, but there's been a little bit more than a year since I've read it, and I still found myself thinking about this book, about the character. It really made me to be angry, to be sad, to be happy.
There is a lot going on.
The story will start with our main character starting a year in this school that it's kind of like supposed to be really military, and they are really strict. And you know, something happens, a war starts to happen, and she starts to discover that she might have a little bit of a shaman power. And then we change gears a little bit with a book that has a lot of fantasy elements, but that is a little bit more complex and also a little bit less known, which is The Ninth Reign. For this story, you will be kind of like in this world that lives kind of like in the aftermath of a war that happens, and this is kind of like a medieval kind of war. We have different characters and kind of like different species almost. We have kind of like the witches, then we have this kind of like almost elves, almost vampires, that are a species that is kind of like in extinction because they are dying from a severe sickness, and then we have kind of like the regular human beings. And we will have three main points of view. We will follow them as they kind of like investigate what is happening in this world, because it seems that a new war might come, but no one in this world remembers why there was a war.
Who are the enemies? How to fight them? They don't remember. No one knows. They don't have a clue.
And you won't have a clue either. So there's a lot of things like the world building, it's very rich in here, and you know, like there's a lot of discovering as you go, as the characters go, so it's very character driven, and that was really interesting. But you need to have a little bit of patience because the story eventually connects the dots, but it's eventually, right? And once they do, it's fantastic, and the trilogy overall was really, really great. And we conclude with a series that is my favorite, and I don't necessarily believe that it's super complex to get into it, but it's definitely commitment, and there's definitely a lot of elements that you need to connect, and that is the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. So each book has around 1,000 pages.
It's gonna be 10 books, so amplify that commitment.
And the story follows as well different points of view in a world where there are different layers of stories. That's why I kind of like consider these to be a little bit more advanced, although the prose and the narration of Brandon Sanderson, it's really accessible, and he does such a good job blending a character and a plot driven story. And Stormlight kind of like talks about this world where there's basically a war between different species, and we have different blades that are able to make people invincible, and due to that, kind of like people want the power. We will have these characters, you know, as we have this war that it's coming, and how they play a role in very different places within this war. We have Kaladin, which is kind of like a bridgeman, no one within this war that is working kind of like in the forefront of the war. Then we will have kind of like the general of one of the bands within this war. We will also have these scholars, and you know, there's a lot of not just people against species, but also kind of like the intrigues that happen within humans. What are their motivations? There's a lot of magic in here, and the magic, it's based on some elements of some creatures called the Spren. I really loved it. It's really fantastic, and I really encourage you to read it. And that was it for today. I really hope you liked this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up, or let me know down below if you would like me to do more videos like this one. Let me know also what are the books that you either enjoyed in this and you will pick it up, or if you have any other recommendation. I publish bookish content every Tuesday and Friday for you to enjoy, and if you haven't checked part 1 of this video, I really think you should do it now, and I'll see you soon. Happy reading. Bye.